by the way?
I do. I have a great pair of Bitcoin sneakers that have a little orange Bitcoin on the side.
No way. Oh, that's super cool. Well,
That
I
is
should have asked you ahead of time to send me a hat or something. I would have worn that. I don't know if you guys have any Hashwatt kits or something like
Hashwatt has very little like fan gear. Harena has an insane amount of fan
Harena.
gear.
Oh, okay. Harena. Oh, that's fine. I'll take a hat
I
from
got
Harena.
this Hashwatt. Now that you put it in my thought pattern, I think we should probably create some nice Hashwatt hats, maybe.
I think so. It's a great name, by the way.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Okay, so we're just doing everything backwards today. All right. Welcome back, shot callers, to the Shot Caller podcast. Today's guest is steeped in experience in Wall Street mergers and acquisitions, having participated in over 70 billion with a B in transactions, including the merger of Time and Warner Communications. He was CEO of Network Acquisition Company, which was formed to purchase a municipal wireless network in Philadelphia. Mr. Pugh's family has a long history in the energy industry in Pennsylvania, having founded Sunoco, Sun Shipbuilding, and Dry Dock, several financial institutions, and one of the largest NGO trusts in the United States. He has a very impressive academic background and supports a wide variety of charities and community organizations. I will include all of these links into the podcast notes for you all to check out, whoever's curious. Currently, Derek is chairman and CEO of Harena Data, an esports community aggregator. I'm going to get a better definition of what that is later, as well as chairman of Hashwatt, an enterprise grade sustainable American Bitcoin mining company. I know some of you might think I've just had something big dropped on my head. Did Shannon just say sustainable and Bitcoin mining in the same sentence? Yes, I did, but that doesn't mean everything's green and dandy. Today, Derek is going to enlighten us on Bitcoin mining, their unique approach from an energy perspective. What are some of the realities and current limitations with renewables? We need to know what those are. And hopefully, what are the promising developments taking shape to help us shift our energy sources towards carbon neutral? I'm hoping we'll also have time to jump into esports with the context of the metaverse, Web 3.0, politics, and God knows where else this will take us. Welcome, Derek, to the Shot Caller podcast.
Thanks, Shannon. That was a mouthful.
I know I always overdo my intros, but I want to set the stage for everybody listening. Now, I had the benefit of spending some time with you on the phone towards the end of last year as we were talking about having you come on the podcast. And I was so enthralled by our conversation, and you were so generous with your time. I think we spent over an hour on the phone, and we sort of bonded on topics outside of Bitcoin and the environment. So I also hope we can lift the hood a little bit more on Derek and your insights just in a broader sense. Again, we had some fascinating conversations around politics, around monetary policy that I think people would really benefit from hearing your insight. So little pieces of gold or crypto, however you want to name it. I think that you're somewhat of a visionary on the next generation of money. That's my personal opinion.
That's a
So
very good statement. So thank you.
I wanted to ask you if you wanted to play a little fun game, a little icebreaker, just to kind of
Good.
set the stage. Okay. Who is in your address book that would surprise people?
Donald
Any
Trump.
Okay, I did have that on the list. Who who's in Now this second question, I didn't know you were gonna say. I thought you could, but I didn't know. So the next question is, who is in your address book that would impress people?
I would hope Lisa Randall. She is
Okay.
just an amazing human being, and I think a real role model for women. If you don't know who she is, she's one of the top astrophysicists in the world. She
Oh,
works at
wow.
Harvard. It's a industry. You look at a lot of industries and say they're difficult for women to get into without
Yep.
changing who they are, and having to compete with an old boys network. And I will tell you, astrophysicists are probably primarily men, and this is just a phenomenal woman. If you haven't read any of her books, do yourself a favor and read them. They're some of the greatest. They're some of the greatest layperson written top level astrophysics books you could ever read. The first one was "Knocking on Heaven's Door," stealing from a
Wow.
Bob Dylan words, and And even though it's a little outdated now because the Higgs field hadn't been really discovered yet at Higgs boson, but in terms of just a general introduction to the outer worldly thoughts around astrophysics, it's just a great book for everybody to get.
I love that. Man, I didn't expect that answer, but that's very exciting. I will definitely have made a note. Okay, before we go on to the reason why we're here, I'm going to name some people just out of curiosity to see if anybody else is in your address book. Dolly, Dolly Parton.
No.
No, come on. Okay, Bruce Springsteen. He's physically close to you.
So interesting. I have actually done shots with Bruce Springsteen at the Stone Pony before, but he is not in my Rolodex.
Okay, well that's close enough. Jeff Bezos, as we're talking about astrophysics.
No, I'm a degree of separation away from Jeff through a number of people, but I've never actually had any conversations with Jeff.
Michael Ovitz.
A great one. I have actually had conversations with him and had some contact with him, but not certainly not a regular in my Rolodex.
Okay, I listened to a fantastic podcast with him. Whose podcast was that on? Uh, was it Tim Ferriss? I can't remember now. Anyway, it was brilliant. It was so interesting. The start of Creative Artist Agency. I actually babysit for him when I was at Pepperdine, and
Oh, no
quite
way.
a few other really famous, wealthy people. And I have a funny story about one time I was driving them. I was driving Michael's son. I was driving the who is it? Brandon, not Hilton, but the oh, I can't remember, another famous heir to a fortune, and then the main family that I used to babysit for. And I took a wrong turn, and we ended up in South Central LA. I don't know where we were trying to go, and I was in their Mercedes, somebody's huge Mercedes, and these kids are just yelling out the window. And I'm thinking, if anybody knew the value of the three kids I've got in this car, they would be held for ransom. I mean, it was I was so stressed out. Anyway, that's another story.
I've had those trips in South Central LA since my little one went to USC, so
Yeah,
I've been all over that part of Los Angeles.
it can happen. I mean, it really can happen. You just take one wrong turn, and it's. I mean, generally speaking, we shouldn't be super afraid, but it was uncomfortable considering the value of the people in the car. Okay, last one. AOC.
um, all around AOC, but not AOC specifically. I think I told you that Liz Warren was my law school mentor, and one of
Yes.
my good friends going to college, Kirsten Gillibrand. So
Yeah.
neither one of those is AOC, but certainly on the woman's side and on the liberal side in the U.S., I have some friends who I've known for a long
We could say AOC adjacent.
time. Right.
Okay, I just thought that would be fun because I had a feeling you had a decent Rolodex, so I thought, well, let's just try and get some more information out of you. Okay. Somewhat ironically, members of Congress are set to gather today to
Yep.
have a hearing focused on energy impacts of blockchain, um, kind of marking the next effort of lawmakers to learn more about the crypto space ahead of expected regulation this year. Some of those testifying, one I hadn't to ask you about was a company called Soluna Computing. The CEO of that company will be speaking. Bitfury CEO, this former CEO of Chelan County Public Utility, and the Bonneville Power Administration, which comes from my part of the woods in the Pacific Northwest, and some other people.
I was watching.
Um, yeah, what do you think is going to be the outcome of that, or do you have any gut instinct?
I don't. I actually think that the roster of people that they've called as witnesses is are more Bitcoin favorable and mining favorable than you might have expected, given the tenor of what created that meeting in Washington, and certainly Liz Warren's letter directly to Greenwich probably about 2 months ago. So, uh, look, I think that there is. I think we've been waiting, or at least we at Hashwatt have been waiting for this shoe to begin to fall,
Mhm.
because what you see, and you and I talked about this before, is human activity on the planet uses electricity for any number of things, right? And whether we consciously make a decision to use it, or let's just call it use of energy, and polluting things, right? Things that cause pollution or some other environmental distress. It's just a sad fact that as population grows, we hurt the planet. And we make those decisions and we tend to focus on ones every now and then. And usually those focuses are based off of some fear.
Mm,
And
mhm,
what I would say is like Bitcoin and decentralized currencies, I think elicit fear generally from the Western world because around World War One and World War Two, global economies had to convince people that currencies not supported by gold, where governments could print money pretty much at will, were important, stable, somehow backed by governments and valuable. And we've had a lot of, maybe 80 years of constantly being told this, which for most of us is all of our lives.
mhm,
Be almost for all of us, nearly all of us, it's all of our lives. And when something shows up that that threatens that thought, um, it elicits fear, and fear is probably the single strongest human emotion. So it's not odd to me that while TV usage in the United States consumes way more electricity than Bitcoin mining does, even in its larger scale right now in the United States, and where a single cruise ship you know needs 60 megawatts of power to like manage what it does on board, and a good sized Bitcoin mine might be 50 megawatts. We tend to target those things that we fear, as opposed to sitting back and thinking about valid allocation of resources for different things that we want to do. So we saw the first shoe in Bitcoin and maybe Ethereum fall on the regulatory front as it relates to securities, right? The
mhm,
Securities
mhm.
Exchange Commission. We've seen some movement from Treasury. We're talking from the US's perspective right now,
Right.
as it relates to banking law and other things. I would say that the historic use of electricity in the United States has never encountered anything like this before. I mean, if you look at the grand scale of operations in the US, significant industrial corporations in the US might have used 40 megawatts of electricity. The only things that we have in the US that really consume absurd amounts of electricity would be, say, microchip fab manufacturers, which there are very few left.
Mhm,
You have an onslaught of mining now in the United States where, some of the mega miners are putting 400 megawatts of usage onto a grid. And those regulatory authorities have never seen that before.
yeah,
So I think we are waiting for this shoe to drop, which is the the designated representatives of the people trying to look at, okay, how much are we really willing to let this industry use in terms of consume, in terms of certain things like energy production? What does that mean about energy production? Like, does it drive renewables? Does it drive non-renewables? I mean, what is it doing? Because it's so overwhelmingly different than anything that they've seen before. That's not surprising to me. And frankly, they should be having conversations about it.
mm,
And
yeah, for
there's
sure,
definitely aspects of what we do that I think they should think about regulating.
definitely. So, there's, kind of a bifurcation of I think this topic. One is Bitcoin mining, and I think to the average person, they think of everything to do with cryptocurrencies is mining. I think it all goes into this mining bucket. And in fact, that's what I want to kind of address on the podcast is that there's the mining topic and the energy that goes with that. And then there's this greater development of blockchain and running transactions on a blockchain. And then you've got, I guess, a sub element there, maybe it sits between the two, where you've got Ethereum going from proof of work to proof of stake. And that proof of stake, somewhere I've got a quote on that, will have significantly less energy attached to it, like 95%. Now I'm reading this. I'm not a miner. I don't understand what the differences are there. But in addition to that, and then I'll just have you comment this. Do you ever look at the visual capitalist?
No,
I'm obsessed with it. I love charts and graphs. I'm a visual learner. So
yeah, that's cool.
anyway, this is can you see it?
Yeah,
Maybe
you
we can go
can.
back. Okay, so this is a chart that shows an interesting trend when China put the curbs on mining.
Mhm.
and where before we had only 4% of US had 4% mining, and that has gone up to August of 2021. From so September 2019 to August 2021, we're now at over 35% of the mining. So it has now definitely accelerated and is, as you rightly said, something the regulators should be talking about. Um, Before we get too far down the road of the philosophy of the whole story, can you tell me the story behind the inception of Hashwatt, how you came to be involved in that, and what it is that makes it different?
Sure. I started not with the Hashwat concept. As you said, my family's been involved in energy for a long time in Pennsylvania, and I had certain patents that I was in control of maybe 10 years ago that related to the extraction of metals from what was effectively the production of certain power plants. And the in particular in waste burning cogen plants, there's valuable metals in what results from burning the carbon, and it's usually iron, aluminum. There can be trace amounts of gold and other metals, and some rare earth metals that are actually very valuable to countries that don't mine them. Generally, most rare earth metals come from either China or Russia. So the it started with that, and I needed to find uh, power plants that were viewed as environmentally friendly, albeit carbon burning, that engage in this particular business. And I wound up falling into the coal waste burning power plant segment. And I think most people, when they hear the word coal, just shudder for whatever reason. Not everybody, obviously, there's people that are pro coal, but for the people with environmental conscience, they think of coal as being very dirty. And the reality is, yeah, I mean, coal does produce carbon dioxide when it's burned. Natural gas produces methane when it's burned. Fossil fuels produce gases when they're burned. And but in this instance, in certain states in the United States, I think in certain countries in Europe and and across the world into Australia, where there was a significant mining industry for a very long time, particularly around coal. What there's like there's not a black and white here. There's a lot of gray, right?
Hmm.
That coal that was produced was so plentiful that only really high grade coal would ultimately get sold and moved to people's homes where they would burn it to warm their homes or to industry. And what was left was refuse that they would literally dump in the woods on acreage and acreage of property that they had. And so in certain places, you have literal mountainscapes of this waste that was dumped by this industry for maybe over 100 years.
Wow.
And it's a major environmental hazard where it sits. It does a couple things. There's so much of it that when it rains, it leaches all kinds of bad things into water and it kills kids. And the existence of carbon within it means that when you get a good lightning storm that crosses it, if you have a lightning strike into the hill, it'll burn basically into eternity, just producing carbon
Jesus.
in the atmosphere. So so every I think humans really like things to be black and white, and they're
Hmm.
rarely black or white. They're almost always gray. So starting probably about 30 years ago, particularly in the United States, there was an effort both at the federal government level and at the state levels to reclaim this land. There are conservation groups that will talk about other potential ways to deal with this problem. But one of the ways that the US decided to do it was say, hey, well, we can produce electricity out of it while removing it from the property and then reclaiming the land. Personally, I think that's actually a very good use. And there was a handful of power plants that were built around this concept, about 15 of them, um, maybe a little bit more. And we like them because the partners that we found for Hashwatt were some of the largest land reclaiming people in the state where Hashwatt exists. So they were doing significant amounts of environmental work. They were very close to environmental agencies. They were
Hmm.
also very close to the electrical regulatory agencies. I mean, we're going to drop down lots of rabbit holes here, but the grid electrical use in any anywhere is way more complicated than people think because it's highly it fluctuates dramatically, and and you need to either have energy production that's available to you for the peak periods or else you have brownouts,
Hmm.
and you need to think about what kinds of power you want to use for that. And in a lot of places, because electricity does not move well, you might not have good access to wind, solar, or hydro. It may
Right.
be an area that doesn't get a lot of sunlight, maybe an area that doesn't have enough river flow, or maybe an area that doesn't have enough wind, or where it does have wind, doesn't have enough places to put windmills. So you have limitations on what you can and can't do. And for us, this was a good green use, right? This was in terms of a fossil fuel based power entity. This was a good use, and we actually tracked down a power plant that was the most modern, using the most modern carbon recapture technologies, substantially cleaner than just
Mm,
about any power plant. And then the net value of what they do to me is dramatically on the plus side for the environment.
okay.
So, um, so, th- so we wound up Hashwatt. What we began to realize very early on was that the real distinguishing feature in mining anywhere was going to be playing by all the regulatory rules, not overeating, and being a good bacteria in the belly of the electrical ecosystem, not a parasite. And what I mean by being a good bacteria in the belly is most renewables, and including this is viewed as a renewable at the federal level and at the state level, are more expensive to generate in general than fossil fuel based electrical production or even nuclear. And because of
Mm,
that, they tend to operate at a net loss for a significant part of the year until they get the spikes, which is when they make their money, right? And spikes, grid prices go up, and now all of a sudden they're in the black. So they're kind of like retailers. Honestly, they're actually a lot like retailers at Christmas time.
yeah.
To be during very cold times that these people make money, and during the shoulder periods could be losing money. Miners play a really interesting role in that. And when we start our negotiations with the power company that we're with, we agreed to be a retail customer of that power plant. I think this is the first time this has ever happened in maybe in U.S. history, in what we call behind the nameplate. So we draw electricity directly from the power plant, not through the grid. And by doing that, we were willing to pay them more than their average grid price during the year, which is still a very good price for us.
Yeah.
Um, but it wound up stabilizing their demand. So the net effect of that was, with stabilized demand, it meant that their business, all their employees, what they were doing in terms of environmental cleanup was stabilized, right? We were creating an economic benefit to that power plant by being there. And I would argue that a lot of the miners that are in hydro facilities and other places where there's a lot of excess electricity that isn't being purchased are probably doing the same thing, right? They're stabilizing demand for what I would say are places we want people or things that we want generating electricity. That's not true of the entire industry.
Yeah.
Um, and then, of course, how you use that energy and beyond its sustainability is very critical. We decided to find locations that were at high latitude, high altitude, where temperature was, pretty
Oh, yeah.
consistent around 50 degrees year round, which meant that we didn't have to waste a lot of electricity on cooling.
Hmm.
Most of our cooling is environmental for what we do. In fact, we're probably one of the most efficient miners, maybe anywhere. Our PUE, which is the ratio of our core use electricity to the amount of electricity we actually use, while that number is close to one, is 1.01. Most data centers run at about 1.3.
Okay.
So, and then of course we are conscious of U.S. regulatory framework. We wanted to be compliant with Bank Secrecy Act. We wanted to be compliant with the SEC. We wanted to be compliant with AML KYC. We wanted pure provenance coins that American financial institutions could use. All those things are inherent in what we do. And I would say, just from a scaling perspective, even though we have access to a very large amount of electricity, our view is we never want to be at an electricity level that winds up being viewed as a parasite by the community. We want to always be at energy use levels in whatever plants we happen to be in, where what we're doing is providing a sustainability solution for those plants and not being a parasite to the grid.
Okay. I've two immediate questions. One is, are you a template for other miners, or is this difficult to put into place, or are there not very many options like what you found
There's
in the
not many
interim? I
options.
suppose
That
as we're transitioning to other, let's say, more sustainable renewability, let's say better. storage technology. I don't know how long off we are from that, those sort of things.
I think, look, I think the big shoe to drop, and we've already seen it drop once in 2021, is the electricity side of Bitcoin, right? You had sort of Elon early on in 2021 complaining about pollution in Bitcoin, which I think in some ways was a misguided concept. Again, a odd targeting of one industry versus others, where there's plenty of environmental damage caused by almost everything that humans do, including the creation of lithium batteries.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of stuff out there that it's easy to point your fingers someplace else, but unfortunately, humans aren't good for the planet in general. So, so that, and then of course the Chinese crackdown.
Mm,
And yes, we've seen significant look. If you're doing $1 billion a year in profit, and all of a sudden you're shut down, you're going to try and find someplace else to make that profit. And the Chinese miners that got shut down moved to Kazakhstan, moved to the
yeah.
United States, moved to other parts of the world, and needed to find someplace else for their rigs. But think about that. Uh, I mean, think about what that looks like even in the United States. The public utility commissions that run electrical grids, they're not used to that.
No.
If people just all of a sudden pop in and say, "Hey, I want to use 400 megawatts," or "Hey, I want to use a gigawatt of your electricity," I mean, in the history of the United States, I don't know that that's ever happened before.
No.
So, and those regulators probably aren't the most advanced people. I mean, they could be very intelligent, great hard workers, but the what that means to the general population, the grid, and whether it uh, drives new renewable energy sources to be created because of the demand that wasn't there before, or in the alternative where maybe is doing things that might not be so good, like taking power plants that weren't on it before and turning them back
Mm,
on for the
yeah.
purpose of Bitcoin mining.
Right.
I, I could argue that there might be some value to that too, especially if they're feeding the grid. There's some good guys in that space, but the whole thing, we've always known that the other shoe that was going to drop, we thought was going to be on the energy side, and I
Yeah.
think we're just starting to see that. We see it in a big way in China. We're going to start to see that in the United States. I think we're going to start seeing that all over the world. Kazakhstan already had a sort of pullback from holy crap. I think all of a sudden three
Yeah.
gigawatts of usage moved into Kazakhstan, and 3 gigawatts of usage is that's enough to light up like Brooklyn and Lower Manhattan.
Yeah.
It's a significant amount of electricity.
Yeah. Just a quick aside. When did you buy your first Bitcoin?
Ah, for me, it was about 5, 6 years ago.
Okay.
We don't. I actually don't. It's so interesting. I'm not a chart following trader of Bitcoin. It's just not what I
Yeah.
do. I'm
Sure.
a macro
Yeah.
Bitcoin. I think that cryptocurrency, in particular Bitcoin, serves a very valuable role on many different levels, both to advanced industry and financial markets and less developed countries where currency value is problematic.
Yeah.
And I think that having a decentralized currency, or maybe a couple of them, is generally valuable to the entire world. So I work on Bitcoin production because of that. Um, I'm not really a speculator in the crypto space at all.
Right. And that doesn't surprise me based on our prior conversations. And I think logically you can see your understanding and experience in the energy industry kind of dovetailing with this need for extreme amounts of or extreme in some cases amounts of energy to mine Bitcoin as the price goes up and more people come into the market and so sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. I'm curious a little bit about kind of the operation and then we'll kind of move on a little bit. But how how long does it take you to mine a Bitcoin? Not you personally, but Hashwatt. I read that the quickest is about 10 minutes and the average is 30 days. So I'm just curious, are you guys also, you must be using the most advanced equipment. I was going to ask you about that. I'm a little bit of a geek trying to learn these sort of things, but I'm also trying to get some stock ideas because I, you know, a big goal of mine is financial and investment literacy. And so I look at frontier markets. I look at the next big thing. I'm a fan of NVIDIA for multiple different reasons. So I'm just curious, what kind of kit are you guys using, and how long does it take you to mine a Bitcoin?
Shannon, I bought my first share of NVIDIA at $26 a share.
Good, good
Um,
move.
it was a
Good
while
move.
ago. It was a
Yeah,
while
and you're
ago, but
holding, and you're holding.
no, actually, no. I gave it to charity a little while ago at about 160. But the uh, yeah, I at the time Nvidia was not popular, and I had a vision of where I thought those markets were going to go, both in terms of automated cars, robotic cars, and
Yeah.
also on the GPU side for Ethereum. And yeah, I was buying it when nobody thought Nvidia was worth anything,
Wow.
um,
Good
but in
move.
any event, let's go back to so Hashwatt is still a relatively young company. Most of what we do, I think there's a misunderstanding of the Bitcoin market in that uh, most miners do not have a full their mining equipment tends to span generations of mining equipment because you
Mhm.
buy it as sort of as you go along,
It's
and
expensive, right? If the
it
It can
depends.
be at least.
And I think that there's also from our perspective, this is more about return on investment than it is of having the shiniest object.
Right.
So, return on investment is a combination of how efficient is the thing that you buy for its production, and how cheaply can you buy it for. So, really, what's your cost per hash is a significant issue to the entire mining community. In China, I want to say probably 30-40% of the miners that came offline in June were probably 5 generations old.
Wow.
And you have to remember that, again, this is not a black and white space. When you're talking about whatever it is, 13 gigawatts of global electricity, 180 million terahashes of production, there's only one fab facility left in the world that can produce chipsets now that can move the needle at all on
Mm.
Hashwatt mining, and that's in
Wow.
Taiwan Semiconductor. Outside of that, there's really no place else. There's only so many chipsets coming out, and when you're talking about a market that big, think about a giant bowl of water that you're just pouring like premium liquor onto the top of. The total liquor content of that water is going to only increase slowly if you can only put so much on the top. So Hashwatt actually has a blend of miners that run from older generation to newest generation that we bought ourselves over the last year. Hashwatt is in the middle of doing some significant financial transactions that
Okay.
will make it a pretty significant company by the end of 2022.
Mhm.
We will be well, hopefully, knock on wood, we will be a stock to watch in 2022.
Okay.
Uh, we are old school. We believe in building cash flow and only bringing in investors at legitimate traditional cash flow valuations as we
Okay.
move forward. Different from a lot of the people that went into the market that had either no power contracts or whatever, and went in and just raised a lot of money just to buy a lot of brand new shiny equipment. Uh, that's not everybody. There were definitely people that had big operations and were just filling them up. But there's all sort, yeah, like in any industry, there's a spectrum of that.
Yeah.
So Hashwatt right now is smallish, produces a Bitcoin uh, roughly every 3 days, something
Okay.
like a Bitcoin. If you controlled the entire market, you would, or at least one twelfth of the market, you produce a Bitcoin every 10 minutes.
Okay. Okay.
The
Okay.
you would be very significant in size to
Okay.
do that.
Yeah.
We currently do multi millions a year of EBITDA
Yeah.
against a relatively smaller investment base that we pulled together from basically our own close investors. That's changed recently because Hashwatt's just done one financing round and is working towards building itself to 50 megawatts, which would be a very, well, for us, a significant size mining operation.
And you have plenty of room to go there energy-wise with your current setup.
Our energy partners control almost 2 gigawatts of electricity, maybe a little bit more. Um, the power plant that we're in right now, we have contracts for only 1/12 of its potential energy production. So
Okay. Mm,
Yeah, like I said, we like to fit in. We like to fit in. I think there's also a lot of people that believe that in Bitcoin mining, there's some sort of winner takes all kind of concept, and it's not. It's not that at all. It's really much more like the global banking industry, right?
yeah,
There's no, there might be some very significant players, but there are some very small banks that are extremely efficient, create great ROIs for their investors.
sure.
And it's true of Bitcoin mining too. Again, I hate the term mining. It's
Yeah.
just so not consistent with actually what we do. We verify transactions in the Bitcoin network. That's what we do. And the part that everybody thinks of as the miner part
Yeah.
was a rule system that the inventors of Bitcoin came up with, which was they wanted it to be free market. So they said, how do we, we'll get to a different point of proof of work and proof of stake. This is the proof of work concept,
Right.
is how do we reward people for investing in wanting to be a transaction validator? And they decide, well, we're going to equate investing with computing power. And that does lead to energy production. No different than high speed trading requires tons of processors running
Yeah.
analysis all the time. There's plenty of financial models out there that use a lot of electricity to get you to some particular result. Here, the front end was, hey, they wanted to, they needed to get a block validated every 10 minutes. It was that was their concept, and they had to come up with some way to say, hey, we want to reward you with your proportional investment to the industry. So you should always expect that you will get to validate transactions that are proportionate to your proportional investment in the industry. And the way they do that is by how much computing power do you have relative to everybody's computing power. That's basically it. So the front end of what I think most people think of as mining is literally just a game to gain the right to be the validator. If you think
Yeah.
about it, a credit card transaction, the bank that issued the credit card does all the validation.
Yeah.
But in a decentralized system, you need some way to determine who should have the reward. And uh, proof of work is based off of how good are you at, how efficient are you, how much do you spend on, and what are you willing to do with computer power on the front end to win the cryptographic solution that gives you the right to validate on the back end. That's what mining is, sort of in two steps. Proof of work is, it means he who holds the most gets to validate the most. So
Okay.
it's a little bit of putting a stake in the ground, saying, well, who's already accumulated the most of it by this point in time, or who is willing to go in and buy more of it at any point in time to have the right to validate transactions. And look, I think there's pluses and minuses to both. I think obviously personally, I think proof of work, though it does use a lot of electricity, I think is more democratic than proof of stake. The boys over at Ethereum will give you many arguments of why that's not the case, but the concentration of Ethereum ownership is pretty significant in handful of people's hands. So
Interesting. I
I,
didn't
I
know
would
that.
look. The other piece of it is the production of new Bitcoin. Remember that the way that the Bitcoin model was created was to limit the total number of Bitcoin ever available to 21 million. And the only way new Bitcoin are produced are by rewarding a banker miner for validating a transaction. And I quite like that model, and it reduces over time. There's certain things that because we engage in proof of work mining that we can do to help support things like futures markets or forward contracts for anything as it relates to Bitcoin, because we know what our forward production of Bitcoin is generally going to look like at any point in time. And so our proof of stake, our proof of work actually enables us to facilitate other kinds of DeFi transactions in ways that a lot of people may not be thinking about.
Okay. I had this down as a question, and you just reminded me to ask you. There's only about 2 million bitcoins left, right, to be mined. Is that?
Right.
Do you have any estimate of what the time frame is to that point, roundabout?
Well, it never, it probably never really. It's like a half life in a radioactive uh, particle, because every time a certain number of Bitcoin are mined, the rewards are halved. So it's like the
Yep.
halving of the life. So the
Yeah.
next halving is going to happen in like 800 days. And
Okay.
what we see is, like, from the mining perspective, our revenue is the value of the Bitcoin mined in Bitcoin price. relative to hash rate. And what we have historically found around halving events is that a halving reduces new supply of Bitcoin.
Hmm.
So it effectively shrinks the demand curve, or it shrinks the forward elements of the of the supply curve.
Right.
And to the demand curve continues to move, you wind up seeing usually pretty significant price movements in
Yep.
Bitcoin around halving events. Um, so look, it will begin to look more and more like brokerage. I envision that if Bitcoin becomes widely adopted, which I think it will, that you will find it looking much more like brokerage fee business where the transaction processors are getting paid contract fees to process transactions, or actually getting fee-based revenue in the meme pool that's waiting to be processed. Um, it's it it's not different than stock market at that point, right? We already
Right.
receive these from people that want to get to the front of the line,
Ah,
that are waiting for their transactions to be validated because they know that we'll pick them if
yeah.
we're going to make more money from them.
Right. Okay. Interesting. So we commented on my hat from the beginning. I know the founder of Bitcoin Swiss and his wife, and the he's just stepped aside and from the chairmanship. And another gentleman has taken over who I've also gotten to know through Nicholas and AC, and he's now the chairman of Bitcoin Swiss. And I've had him on the show twice, talking first of all about Bitcoin and also he talked about the halving, and then secondly he started another company digitalizing shares, private companies in Switzerland, and he helped to write the law. So he did explain a little bit that the idea behind the Bitcoin having, and so I had some kind of comfort zone with what that sort of means. But again, I'm no expert. And also, I wanted to make one little point about what you said about the democracy aspect of this and the idea that everybody shares, in the if you provide the validation, then you get paid for that. The incentive is that you get a portion of that, and that has sort of really been pivotal in opening up the entire decentralized finance space that we're now seeing blooming at the moment. And maybe we can get into that a little bit deeper after we kind of close out the environmental side, because that is an important topic to me. But the point I'd like us to come back to on this is that, and you mentioned security regulation, which is interesting to me because so quickly the space moves, and now you've got these initial IDOs, where you really have decentralized organizations popping up where nobody's controlling it. There's sort of this governance by voting in group, and you don't have sort of a board where you have to go and get regulation to sell a security or a security token. So anyway, maybe we can come back to that a little bit because I find it fascinating how the space is iterating and sort of saying, okay, we don't want to be regulated as securities. We want everybody to kind of be part of the ecosystem. And anyway, so we'll come back to that in a second. And I know that's a big one. There are a few companies out there who are trying to move the needle on greener data centers, greener sort of energy. They all sort of come together. So you've got Equinix, Iron Mountain. They launched this green power pass. Um, and then I read a little bit about how they did kind of something with oh no, it was digital. Was it Digital Realty or Iron Mountain did something with Facebook, and it, basically it sort of looked good, and Facebook could sort of claim that they were sourcing their energy from solar, but in essence it was really just kind of offsetting carbon credits in the end. They weren't actually bringing Facebook wasn't actually using solar from the grid. They were offsetting it with somewhere else where somebody was using it. Now there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, we're moving, like I said, we're moving the needle, but I think the average consumer also gets really confused because you think somebody's doing something good, and then you think, well, why doesn't everybody else do that? Look at this company. Look at what Google's doing. What Facebook are doing. Why can't the whole industry do that? But the reality is it's not so straightforward, and they are doing a bit of greenwashing here, aren't they? Even though there's an effort to do things better, so I don't want to completely shame them. They are manipulating the environment as well, right? I mean,
I mean, there's certainly a an economic benefit to companies appearing like they are green to green investors,
right,
and um, I don't think that, look, all these things are incrementally positive.
right,
I think what the average consumer probably doesn't understand, and I'm going to talk very specific to the United States, is
yeah,
the vast majority of electricity in the United States, probably like I think it's like 85% is not renewable. It's
right,
other stuff, and um, and while any number of things, whether it's natural gas, petroleum based, nuclear, coal, or waste based cogen. That's like almost all the electricity used in the United States is produced by those things. There
right,
is some amount of renewable out there as well. And as I told you, I think what a lot of people don't understand is that electricity does not like to travel. It,
right,
it really doesn't. And I think when people see high tension wires, they like, oh no, of course it likes to travel to those high tension wires. Well, that's true. It requires a fair amount of up voltage to get to a high enough voltage that the electricity will actually move any decent distances. But even with that super high voltage, it doesn't really like to go very far. And relatively speaking, like you're not going to be generating hydro in Niagara Falls and feeding Los Angeles.
right,
That's not happening. So when you move to these renewable sources of electricity, you're talking about pretty localized use. Look, a solar panel in your house is great. If you
mm,
can generate electricity for your own house, that's not going to dissipate between the time it gets from your roof down into your
right,
house. Whether you're actually feeding the grid with your excess energy or if that's just a regulatory concept, it's probably just a regulatory concept, right? They want to give you an incentive to put that solar panel on your roof, and maybe they're willing to give you some sort of credit into the grid. You're really not feeding anybody else probably in the grid with that solar energy. So there's a lot
but
of misconceptions.
incrementally, you're doing something better because you're taking away the
Absolutely.
demand, your own personal demand, so I
Your own personal demand, absolutely.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I would so I guess what I would say is most of what you see in larger grid markets is carbon credit based. You're not if someone says, "Hey, please buy our wind energy into the grid and create a direct contract," you're really creating a direct contract for a carbon credit going back to that company. You're not really getting. I mean, the grid doesn't know. The grid is
yeah,
just a big batch of electricity. It doesn't know whether it's coming from the wind power plant or from a coal plant.
right,
It's coming to your house no matter what. So yes, like for example, our partners happen to represent because they do so much environmental work in the state, something like 36% of all the carbon credits in the state. So just to put it in perspective, like where we sit in a highly environmentally you know viewed as valuable operation, this concept of whether you're green or not green, I think it's again, you're in the shades of gray. I suppose you could build a big mining facility where all it was solar panels and you were off grid, and you could probably make a legitimate claim that you were just solar based. Solar based power is could be useful for that. Doesn't mean that producing a solar grid doesn't produce pollution too. And this goes back to all these questions that everybody's had about, well, okay, what's the global, impact of any one of these solutions? Almost all of them hurt the environment. It's just a question of which is hurting the environment more, maybe. Is this less hurtful for the environment? I think I made a joke with you that I was at a lunch with an investment banker from California who was giving me crap about Bitcoin mining destroying the planet. And he was drinking like almond milk in his
yeah,
coffee. And,
yeah,
it's like, I guess you're just picking and choosing your battles because there's a massive drought in California and almonds use an insane
yeah,
amount of water.
yeah,
So, so
yeah,
there's very little that we do as humans that doesn't have some injurious effect someplace. And you can pick a cause just because it resonates with you. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's really, really hard to live a life, that is truly not environmentally damaging. It just is. So look, I think it's good. Any of us that care and we're actually thoughtfully thinking what we do is generally benefiting.
and
Other
I
people
like
might
your
disagree.
incremental comment.
Yeah. I think that that's all positive, right? If you're incrementally helping more renewable energy be created, great. I think that's awesome. we think what we do incrementally is very good for our local environment and probably even the global environment, even though what the energy source we ultimately use isn't completely clean. It does generate its own form of problem, but it solves more problems than it creates.
Right. And I let me summarize and hopefully I get this right. You're not saying we shouldn't do better, industry shouldn't do better, we shouldn't attempt to be cleaner in the way that we're living. You're just simply saying everybody's polluting. So it may not move everything forward if everybody's pointing fingers at the other person and saying, well, look at what almond milk is doing here. Look at what nuclear does there. Look at what coal does here. And rather we all just need to just basically constantly try and do a bit better and hold the big polluters responsible, I think, and ask them, come on, you can do better. In most cases, can you do better? Then you should do better. But I'm reading Atomic Habits, if you know that one. And,
Yes.
it's sort of like if you do 1% better every day, you're at the end of the year 37% better at whatever it is you're trying to achieve. And I think that's a good way to sort of look at it is that if we all just kind of do a little bit better, then we're at the end of a year or a decade. I mean, we've made probably pretty um,
But I would say the
material
one
progress.
other thing is, like, I think one of the things you've asked me before is, topics I think a lot about, and I think a lot about the topic of fear,
Yeah.
and I think a lot about the topic of emotional affirmation, which relates to fear. And a lot of people talk about an opioid crisis in the world. I think that there's an emotional affirmation crisis in the world, primarily driven by algorithms and social media. It
Mhm.
feels when you are scared of something or you don't like something, it feels really good to hear information that affirms that. It's like a drug. I think
Yeah.
I'm not a scientist, but I'm assuming it gives you a great dopamine rush.
Oh, for sure.
If I don't like you, Shannon, and someone were to tell me something that was completely false about you, it would make me feel really good to want to believe that because
Yeah.
it's emotional affirmation. I think you have to be careful about when you look at global industry of worrying that the causes that you're pushing are not just you affirming your emotions.
Yeah.
Um, there's something about looking globally and realizing that humans use electricity for lots of things that we don't think about. We leave. I'm looking around my place here right now. I've got my cell phone plugged in over there.
Yeah.
I see a television in the other room that's plugged in.
Yeah.
I have a plug over here that's running to a computer cable, but the green light on the transformer is on, even though the computer's not plugged in. This computer is plugged in. The light that's beaming on my face is
Yeah.
plugged in.
I got
I
two
mean,
lights on my face.
it's
Yeah.
like, and I don't have an emotional anything for any of those things. So no affirmation is going to hurt, but other bigger things.
Yeah. I mean, they're all excellent points, and I think at the end of the day, we need to stop kind of kidding ourselves that there's a good or a bad, usually, right? And that we just need to start working towards solutions that somehow maintain our existence in the long run, right? But also don't. I mean, when you talk about fear, and maybe this drives us into the political topic. I've experienced now, really, for the first time in my lifetime, probably starting with 9/11, how fear can be weaponized to get people to back a topic. And up until, of course, let's just say January 6th is a dramatic point to what happens when you weaponize fear. And I'm not even trying to pick specifically on one party, because historically fear has been weaponized by all different sorts of people and parties and things like that. But it's quite discomforting, to say the least. And I think we have a crisis. I think we have a mental health crisis. And yeah, you take away the opioids, you take away the drugs, you take away whatever, and you're dealing with a lot of unhappy human beings running around, especially in America and the Western world. And consumption of things isn't making us happy, right? And so, I mean, these are huge, huge topics. And That's probably one of the reasons why I really love the decentralized economy, even though, I recognize that that does come with energy complications to it. And, we kind of talked about this comment that I had about being a hypocrite, and by just simply saying that I was interviewing somebody in Bitcoin, that I was somehow promoting, a lack of sustainability, and that's just a really, yeah, I mean, it's just a useless, kind of a useless for me. I'm out here trying to make a difference. Maybe I'm not doing it every day. I'm trying to inspire women, young people, trying to show them ways that they can do better. And I've changed patterns myself. For instance, I've consciously buying a lot more cosmetics that are using much less packaging and plastic, and less water in them, because water is expensive to ship. And so there are behaviors that I've made that are kind of, I think, environmentally positive. But you're right. I mean, my kids, I have 3 kids. That's more children than I mean, I directly contribute to climate change with my 3 children. So, I mean, you can, we're all hypocrites, I guess, at the end of the day. But,
It's I don't know that it's a hypocrite. It's just literally a better understanding of not
yeah.
letting. You have to globally think about all this stuff, and yes, from like the political standpoint, I to the point I made before, social media and the engagement of algorithms that will drive information to you that make you feel good. Emotional information is a very frightening thing in this world, and I think if everybody were to step back a little bit and say, did that thing really make me feel good and why? And if it's just because you had some negative emotion and it triggered it, is look, you were in markets before, and I was in
Mhm.
markets before. Markets are pretty much all fear based.
Mm.
There's and they're fear based on the upside and on the downside,
Yeah.
and I don't think
Yeah.
people understand that. And it's really this battle between FOMO and FUD, right? Like when stocks are going up, you fear that you're going to miss
They're
out.
missing out.
You're not going to make your money, and when they're going down, you fear that there's something that you're not understanding, or or some level of disappointment, and literally upward and downward movements in markets are all fear driven, both
Yeah.
sides to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So all of this, all of this stuff, I think plays into it. I wanted to go back into one point though that I think people don't
Yeah.
understand about the decentralization and why it's important for Bitcoin, and maybe something that you said earlier in your conversation. I- If humans live to be 400 years old, then whatever the average lifespan is now, we would find modern currencies, fiat currencies, to be bizarre. We would find them completely bizarre because for most of that 400 years of our life, there was some relatively stable supply, something that limited the actual amount of currency was allowed to be produced. And it would have been for at least three-quarters of our lives. Because we live to be how old we live to be now, most of us have never actually experienced the world that way. But in terms of human history, it's almost always been that way. So for like the hundreds of thousands of years in human history, we use something that had limited supply as a marker for trade, out of convenience, out of an agreement, out of compact. And it ultimately became gold just because gold was the one precious metal on the planet that was the least capable of increasing its supply, regardless of how much you mined it. And we, for geopolitical warfare reasons, changed that and had to convince everybody that that was no longer the case. We came up with a very elegant term that means printing money, called quantitative easement. Most people don't understand this, and you can look at it pretty much everywhere in the world now, particularly in Western countries. During COVID and even a little bit before in the United States, we began printing quantitative easement, effectively money. We didn't raise taxes, we didn't issue new bonds, we effectively printed money. And when you think about that, money is what you're valuing goods in. It's kind of like a very viscous, like fluid in a swimming pool. You're pouring it into one side of the swimming pool and think of every little tile at the bottom of the pool as a good or service. And slowly, the viscous fluid is going to fill out over all of those and make all of their prices rise. It's no surprise that there's inflation. Why would anybody be surprised by that? And I
No.
think I think the saddest part to me is that quantitative easement is effectively a tax on people who don't have enough wealth to be invested in markets or real estate. large
Yeah.
amounts of real estate. That's really what it is. So it's really middle class, lower class, maybe even slightly upper middle class people around the world are the people that are most damaged by that. And Bitcoin was produced into the 2008, 2009 global almost depression.
Yep.
And the reason for its creation was to say, hey, you need to stop. You can't allow basically the politically powerful and wealthy dictate when your government's going to print money to save their behinds.
Yep.
You need some system that can't do that. And that's the democratization concept behind cryptocurrencies. And I think it's a very critical one. It's very surprising to me that people like Elizabeth Warren are opposed to Bitcoin for reasons that have nothing to do with the egalitarian aspects of Bitcoin that actually supports the constituency she's trying to protect.
Yep.
Because the reality is, and you can go back through history, governments will do what it takes to protect the wealthy and the powerful to the detriment of everyone else in times of crisis. And the easiest, quietest way to do that is by printing money. Because when you print money, it moves into the banking system. It then creates inflation in the financial markets. And inflation in the financial markets is viewed as capital gain. It's like even a better word than inflation, right? Inflation in real estate markets is viewed as capital gain. That's a really good sounding thing. Inflation on like carrots is viewed as inflation, but it's the same inflation that happened in real estate and in stock markets. It's just that viscous fluid sort of flowed out very slowly. So this democratization of finance is an idea of being able to create products and currency where there isn't that kind of influence on the use of it. And I think just as a a philosophical concept, having that out there generally keeps people honest. It creates alternative forms of transactions that keep people honest. And I've always been a big proponent of Bitcoin because I think even in high end financial institutions, it creates efficiencies. There are
Yeah.
great efficiencies in being able to use a single common currency, which is probably why the European Union created the euro. There are efficiencies in having common currencies across geopolitical boundaries. Bitcoin is a currency that sits across all geopolitical boundaries and easily floats into the metaverse without the
Yeah.
traditional banking problems that are not helpful in the metaverse, or even the existence of multi fiat currencies, which are not helpful in the metaverse. So, so look, there's when someone comes to you and says, I, when someone actually says, how can you be pro Bitcoin if you're not pro sustainability? The question to really ask them is, I assume you're assigning no value to Bitcoin because you do watch TV at home, right? Or you do leave a light on at home, or you do have a refrigerator, or you do have any number of things that use
Drive a
electricity,
car, fly a plane. Yeah. All of
any
it.
of those things. But for whatever reason, you're picking this, which means you're not assigning value to it. And let me explain to you what the value is of this, because the value of it is profound
It
across
is.
geographic populations, across the world, let alone within countries. And you're just not appreciating it because it's more profound than your television watching, which in the aggregate is using probably more electricity than just about anything else in the entire world.
Yeah. Specifically to politicians, what are they getting wrong about digital currencies and the blockchain ecosystem? Is it down to their fear that the what is it that they're getting wrong here and that they're not seeing the potential? Is it just a lack of vision? Is it just rote responses? What
I
is it
think
that
I think
scares
it's not.
them?
I think it's not having time to understand it. Look, monetary policy is boring even to people that want to be economics majors in college. I've always loved it, which just shows what kind of weird freak I am. But but I think it takes. I think they get like when I talk to very smart politicians, they tend to be totally confused about what Bitcoin mining even is. Right?
Yeah.
The way they describe it to me is not actually accurate. It is very common human behavior. I'm starting to sound like I'm a sociologist. I'm not.
Well, the
To
two go very hand in hand, I think.
to miss a couple, to maybe get a couple assumptions right and then get an assumption wrong. And I'll give you an assumption base that tracks but is not accurate. So some politicians will say a lot of older people are being defrauded by schemes around cryptocurrency. That's true. That's a good assumption, right? The second one might be, well, then cryptocurrencies must be bad. Well, the one doesn't lead to the other. right? The first assumption is correct. The second assumption does not logically have anything to do with the first assumption. The reality is people committing mail fraud is bad, whether they're doing it for a penny stock or whether they're doing it for gold or a rare collectible coin or for a cryptocurrency. It's the fraud that's bad. It's not the industry. Another good example. I see I see people doing like a cyber attack hostaging using
Mhm.
cryptocurrency for ransom. Okay, that's actually not often true, but it does get politicized when it does happen. So my next thought is cryptocurrencies must be helpful for criminal acts. First assumption is correct. It's actually a factual statement. Second correction has no logical connection and it's actually highly false. In the Bitcoin industry ourselves, when the hostage situation, the cyber attack hostage situation happened in the Mid Atlantic states around
Yeah.
natural gas pipeline, it took the FBI like 3 days to find that transaction because in the Bitcoin network, unless as a criminal, you create 1,000 accounts that are your own accounts in Bitcoin and are willing to expend all of that energy to
Yeah.
move payments to you across thousands of accounts, any single Bitcoin miner in the world can see the movement of the Bitcoin from one account to your account.
Yeah.
If I go and I hand a suitcase full of euros or a suitcase full of US dollars to somebody, it doesn't show up in any transactional document.
Yeah.
There's no ledger that shows that happening.
Yeah.
And so a lot of these like fundamental concepts, and I've worked on a task force on this in London, that there are these fundamental mistakes made in assumption basis. And again, I think they move back to emotional affirmation. I'm scared of Bitcoin initially. I see that people are engaging in fraud around Bitcoin. So let me solve two emotional problems for myself and say we should just like regulate Bitcoin because it's leading to fraud. No, the fraud's predated Bitcoin. It's been around forever for just about everything.
Yeah.
It's just you chose emotionally that you didn't like the Bitcoin piece of it, so you decided to go after it. You can see the same thing in private equity markets in the United States. Fraudulent conveyance exists in some number of PE transactions, private equity transactions.
Of course.
Therefore,
Theranos, venture capital. The the I mean, the fraud is
absolutely,
everywhere. Yeah.
wherever you choose to highly leverage the target company within a private ecosystem that puts that company in jeopardy and leaves it with too few assets, even if it's beneficial to the investors that came in, that effectively in the US is a fraudulent conveyance. Does that happen? Sure, it happens. Fraudulent conveyance is not good. Doesn't mean that the whole PE industry is bad,
Right.
but if you're emotionally predisposed to not liking the PE industry and you find that thing that's wrong, hey, fraudulent conveyance is bad everywhere. Regulate fraudulent conveyance. Don't try and throw out the entire PE industry. So there's a lot of this that happens on the political side where you see a bad, you have some emotional dislike for something else, and you make a leap where the process then crosses what was really the right thing to do, which you forgot what the core thing was that you're trying to get wrong. I think that's that and the lack of really understanding of this in general, or even the time to spend on it with all the problems in the world that politicians have to look at. I
Yeah.
don't blame them for any of this. I think this is a highly complicated topic that um, that and politicians are humans, and for all the reasons we just talked about, it leads to me problematic discussions and decision making.
They just wanna find a quick solution to a complicated problem they don't understand
It
sometimes.
usually means throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you, out of curiosity, another podcast I listened to was with the former prosecutor, not of the Silk Road, um, guy, but of the FBI agent, I think it was a NSA agent that were involved in those transactions separately. They were on the same task force, 2 different agencies, and, she tells this story. That must be a Tim Ferriss episode, and it is absolutely fascinating, and she explains how the blockchain was actually, because she didn't know anything about Bitcoin going into that, and she had to prosecute these guys and kind of get up to speed on it, and everybody was like, Bitcoin's bad," and, it was our husband was like, "I think you need to look into actually what Bitcoin is before you just assume it's really bad." She ended up leaving the government after successfully prosecuting these two people, and then going to work for, I believe it's Andreessen Horowitz as venture capital, or is it Lightspeed Ventures? Anyway, one of the two, and now is investing heavily into blockchain technologies and things like that. So anyway, that's really fascinating. Um, okay, I'm
That's where Tim Draper bought all. I think that's where Tim Draper bought his stash of Bitcoin. I think he bought it from the FBI.
It's amazing. Quickly, can you I one thing that is sort of relates to this a bit, but it takes a different angle to it, is your thoughts on the Chinese digital yuan and why that's something that people need to watch and be aware of?
Yeah, look, I think that's really significant. I think the US dollar benefits dramatically from World War II. And
Mhm.
the fact that the US came into that late and was fortunately on the successful side of that war and Bretton Woods treaties that related to the wars, created basically a global demand set for the US dollar. And if you think of anything, whether it's a currency or whether it's the hat on your head, um, prices are set by supply and demand, right? And so when you can create a higher demand set for anything, its price is going to go up.
Right.
All other things equal. So the U.S. dollar has had this huge benefit of global price support that at least started with treaty, and I think some would just sort of suggest is military power based, right? Obviously, the Chinese economy continues to get larger, and the yuan has never really made its way into the global basket economy because they weren't part of those treaties, and just because of the more recent nature of the advancement of that entire economy. So, look, the movement to a digital currency to me is like the antithesis of Bitcoin, right? Like someone might say, who's just a layperson, well, okay, well, that looks like a government moving into its own cryptocurrency. Remember that the concept behind Bitcoin is that I'm trying not to let any central government overwhelm, like dictate what I do, or dictate how valuable my currency is. The digital yuan is the exact opposite, which is I can watch every single transaction that every single person makes real time, and I can control those people by saying, you know, you were in Tiananmen Square protesting. Oops, I'm sorry, your savings account disappeared. Or, oh, you were great to this local official. Wow, your savings account just improved, right? It's the ultimate control. If you control centrally, not just the means of supply creation, and to some extent are trying to manage demand. When you control currency, that's absolute control, right?
Yeah,
Because no one can do anything without you knowing exactly what they're doing or controlling it. Um,
it's
and I,
frightening.
yeah, now, but look, you can find these great arguments. I could see the U.S. being tempted I could see Western cultures. You can see the arguments on the more conservative side would be more towards, say, the economic side of the argument for having digital yuan in China. This is better for us to be able to make like limit our regulatory decisions because we have more information about transactional, so we can do less as a government to support more free market. On the liberal side, it will be, hey, you have unbankable people in the United States. We need stimulus to make its way all the way down to everybody when we decide to do stimulus. And here we have a more effective way to get stimulus out. So you could see both edges sort of making their arguments about why this could be interesting. But I've always suggested that really the first battle between, say, the US and China will be a currency battle.
Mm, sure.
And so the digital yuan, um, I have no idea how to pronounce yuan. I
I
just
know.
say,
I also don't know what's the right
but
one either. We'll
but
go with that.
the proliferation of that, right, and the ability to deliver goods and services at say discounts or something else if you buy them directly with digital yuan is a way to infiltrate global markets with a currency that wasn't available before, right? Like you and I aren't going to go to a bank unless we're speculating probably and go buy Chinese currency. But if it's just sitting on our cell phone and I can get a better deal on my oatmeal or a hair dryer or whatever it happens to be, and it's just because I happen to have that digital currency in my phone, I'll probably use it.
Yeah.
right? So it's sort of insidious how that can spread around the world, and I certainly think that that's if they're not going to win it by political battle and trying to get into the bundle of currencies, then why not end around it and just turn it into something that's digitally fungible and not manageable outside of China by dropping it onto people's cell phones or computers and then creating incentives for its use.
Yeah.
It's sort of brilliant in its own way.
Right.
It scares me to a certain degree because I'm worried that Western governments will feel compelled to move in that direction. But I think what's really important for a listener of your podcast is to realize that a digital currency created by a central government is going the exact opposite direction
Yeah.
of centralized cryptocurrencies. It's about as opposite as you could possibly be.
Yeah. Okay. We are, I know, trespassing on your time, and I think you've got just a few minutes left, and I've got pages of notes left. Can you, and maybe just in the short period of time we have left, give us an overview for why you think the future of esports and gaming is both a legitimate but really promising economy and sort of investment space?
Yeah, sure. I put my on my other hat.
Very, like 2 minutes.
I've been in this virtual world for such a long time. Look, think about uh, think about that. There's 7.5 billion people in the world, and 2.5 billion of those people on any given day make a decision to allocate some portion of their time to living in a virtual world, usually denominated by a game. As a third of the world's population self-determines to do that. So they're doing it because they're getting some value out of it, right? And you can go back to theories of why do what does it mean to be alive and what do you look for in life? Well, they've all clearly made some decision that something that they're looking for in life they are getting from that gaming world. What I will tell you on the gaming side of it is that it while there's maybe some games that have less value to them in terms of personal development, particularly multiplayer games,
Mm,
games that require communication between two individuals that involve any level of strategy and thought and communication, probably create the exact same um, personal growth benefits of things that we've always been very adamant about people pursuing, particularly in the Western world, which is sport. And I think there's always been a view in the Western world that you learn certain basic educational things within a classroom, and you learn other life skills that are critical to business in extracurricular stuff. Whether it's being part of a play, it's usually team based. Whether it's a sport or whether it's some group activity, it's usually team based. It could be some other things, but you find other personal growth there. If you look at the past like 10 presidents of the United States, I want to say like 60% of them were collegiate athletes. And that's a
mhm.
strange thing. That's a very small percentage of the population, but it just shows how much emphasis Western culture puts on the leadership skills that you find either by being in the military or by being on some sort of sports team.
Mhm.
So I think the value of gaming is that to just the personal growth side is in the multiplayer games it opens the opportunities for personal growth leadership sacrifice teamwork to probably a much broader segment of the population that would have otherwise been exposed to it at high levels just on playing fields, and
Mm.
I think that's a huge win. And I think virtual worlds can be very beneficial in a lot of ways for senior populations and even younger
Yeah.
populations. I think that for spectrum children, I think there's some really interesting aspects of what virtual world interaction can do for them. So I think there's a tremendous amount of personal growth value in terms of economic and geopolitical value. It's dramatic, right?
It's sizable.
Yeah, it's sizable because you think that there's 2.5 billion people playing games. When you move into a metaverse, there's not geopolitical boundaries,
Yeah.
right? So you don't self-identify yourself as being an American me from Philadelphia, you just view yourself as say a League of Legends player and whatever
Yeah.
your gamer tag name is. And my if I were to play sport here, I would probably be playing from people in my local environment. They would generally have the same
They'd look
sort of
like you,
sense.
they'd sound like you, they'd,
Yeah,
shop like
they'd
you.
be listening to the same radio stations, watching the
Yeah,
same TV broadcasts, and whether, regardless of what side of, say, the political spectrum they were on, we were all being informed by basically the same information, and
yeah.
and so we had commonality to us. In these other worlds, we've got to communicate with people who could be from anywhere in the world. You're beginning to learn about like a global population, global reaction, and everything else. And I said, look, business is becoming global. Are you better? Are you learning better skills, competing with a lot of people from a lot of different countries all the time in team-based play that's highly competitive than you are playing, say, soccer in a field behind your house?
Yeah.
And the answer may be yes, right, for what the future looks like. Um, think about what that looks like for currency, right? Fiat currency is very problematic in virtual worlds. Um, Traditional laws, not the same in virtual worlds because the laws are created by the publishers. Uh, Crossover, which is what Arena does, which is the crossover between traditional world organizations that are looking to use metaverse solutions into their traditional world solutions. That's a complicated bridging gap, and that's what we do as a video gaming company. Is we help traditional organizations build league play, understand ways to develop uh, personal growth aspects of whoever their target audience is, all that stuff. Arena is basically, we call ourselves the portal between the traditional world and the gamer metaverse.
Well,
And
I'm gonna
and
put a link to that, and I don't know, maybe we at another point have an opportunity to go deeper into that, because I'm gonna give you my prediction. I think I happen to have 3 Gen Z children between 11 and 19. And my 19-year-old just got into League of Legends in the last year. The 11-year-old is loves Roblox and a bit of Fortnite, and I think that I'm going to call them Gen Z and Meta Z. And I think Meta Z, which is basically the Gen Zs that are really getting involved in the metaverse now, I think that they have the potential to out earn their parents by the time they're 30, potentially cumulatively earnings from their parents. I think the moving skins around from one game to the next, interoperability is obviously it's a challenge, but it's a potential opportunity. I buying land. I mean, all of this is just it's exploding. It's very exciting.
NFTs. Yeah, the digital commerce in the digital space, and this is why back to Lisa Randall. This is why
Yeah.
you should read books on
Okay.
astrophysics
Okay.
physics
Okay.
because most of what happens in the universe you cannot relate to something you see on Earth, and that makes
Huh.
forcing people to think about astrophysics a lot like forcing them to think about the metaverse because for whatever reason, someone can decide, oh yeah, I get it why a Picasso can sell for $32 million. It's paint on a sheet of paper, but I don't get why an NFT will sell for $32 million. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
I don't understand why when it crosses into the digital world, that triage nurse in people's brains is like digital
Yeah.
goes over here, which is like I do not understand, and everything else
Yeah.
goes over here
Yeah.
because a collectible is a collectible, right? It doesn't matter what it
Yep.
is, and in some versions of digital assets, the digital asset can create an experience for you, right? Like
Yes. Yes.
if you were to say buy a collectible airplane that also allowed you to sim fly that plane,
Yeah.
you'd be able to get an experience you could not get in the real world, which would be
Yeah.
flying an antique plane that you couldn't find otherwise.
Yeah.
So
It's
there's
a utility, an additional utility to it. Yeah.
absolutely mental training, cognitive training,
Yeah.
decision making skill sets that can be very limited in traditional world can be managed frequently in the non-traditional world. Limitations of personality type, player profile can be altered. Do I do like we do this with some sports people? I know we're about to run out of time here, but a
It's
lot
your
of
schedule. I'd spend 3 hours with you if
no,
I
no, no.
could.
Look, a lot of people in traditional world sports or even in traditional world work, I happen to be one of them. My performance immediately after my making a mistake gets worse.
Yeah.
That's how I'm wired. I cognitively know that. I work on using virtual assets to train me to bounce back from a bad event and not let it affect my next decision. Very hard to do in the real world. So
Interesting.
there's a lot of things where the virtual world crosses over in the traditional world, including digital assets, where look, the traditional world's what $73 trillion worth of transactions or something in a given year. I forget what it is. The digital world might be 180 billion or some number like that now, but there's no doubt that by the time our kids are in their 40s, that they will be moving in and out of digital, non-digital worlds seamlessly, not even thinking about it. And more likely than not, the digital transactional universe will be, size that mirrors in some ways the traditional size, and
Absolutely. I believe that.
probably driving even more demand for things like Bitcoin.
Exactly. Okay, so I quickly in less than a minute, let's do rapid fire. You've already given us a book recommendation, so I can skip that. What's the best $100 or less you spent on yourself in the last year? Anything.
Cordyceps.
What is it?
Cordyceps. It's a
Oh,
Chinese.
cordyceps,
Yeah.
the mushroom.
Yes.
Yeah, I love it. I drink Four Sigmatic shakes all the time with a bunch of mushrooms. Okay,
Yep.
um, what is the weirdest thing anyone has ever told you?
My father-in-law predicted that Donald Trump would be president of the United States in 1997.
Wow, wow, that's crazy. Too bad he didn't like write that down and put it in a time capsule. Then he could make an NFT out of that. Okay. Um, what advice would you give a 15 to 20-year-old today in order to be most prepared for the future?
I would say read the work of some futurists that resonate with you. I'm a keyboard player in a rock band on the side, so I like Ray Kurzweil, and look at what
Ah,
the predictions are for when you're going to be 40. Pick the ones that resonate most with you. Define what that world looks like, and then think about how you build yourself to fit into that world in 20 years.
okay, good one. And what's your definition of a wealthy life?
Um, living with gratitude in the moment.
Thank you so much for your time, Derek. And I will be in touch with you when we're going to publish this. And I can't wait to, yeah, see how some of this unfolds and maybe come back to the Harena story a little bit more in the future.
It's a real pleasure, Shannon. Have a great
Thank you so
day.
much. I really appreciate it. You too. Cheers.